Hey guys, we're with Ace from the Sega 16 forums and a million other places online. How you doing, man?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Thank you very much for taking the time to do the interview. I've been a fan of your work since before my website was even a website, and I was following your progress on Sega 16. So,
Thanks for that.
now
I'm
you
actually looking
are
forward
the
to this.
writer of the How to Tell a Good Genesis from a Bad Genesis forum topic, right? You're the original
That's correct.
creator? So that has been like the Genesis Bible for so many people who are looking to figure out their motherboard revisions and the different things. How did that even start?
That was actually about 11 years ago when I got my first Genesis, which was actually a VA7 Model 1. I wasn't aware of all the little quirks of the Genesis at the time, but that was also when I had seen the first audio mod for the Genesis, which was actually the crystal clear audio mod.
Hmm.
And over time, I ended up accumulating a couple of other Genesis Model 2s as well, because this one actually had a faulty controller port. And I have a family friend who owns a pawn shop, and he had quite a number of Genesis Model 2s, some Model 1s, so I figured I'd get a Genesis Model 2 in. And that's when I really started to see that some things just didn't really work out very well, because the first thing I noticed when I had plugged in this Genesis was the composite video was absolute crap. I didn't have access to RGB at the time, or even S-Video. I wasn't even aware of that at the time. So I plugged it in over composite, and I just saw vertical lines streaking down the screen when the VA7 I had prior didn't even have that. And on top of that, there was the crystal clear audio mod that I had brought up earlier. I was not noticing the bad audio quality from the VA7, specifically because I didn't actually have an AV cable at first. I was just reusing the RF box from my NES. Although that actually is what brought the audio quality differences to my attention.
The RF box?
No, the crystal clear audio mod. No,
I was gonna
the
say,
RF
you can
box.
tell the difference through RF?
Well,
I mean,
if you
can a
really
little
listen
bit,
with
but-
headphones, because through speakers it's not as obvious.
So the crystal clear audio mod. Now that's not the one that you worked on, correct?
No,
That's
no,
just
that's
the
not
original
that's
one
not
that
my
was
doing.
out floating around.
Right, that was made by a certain. His username is TMEE on Sega 16.
Mm-hmm.
I had built the circuit, and I personally was not actually that impressed with the result, because a few things. The design was actually quite complex, with quite a number of transistors followed by an op-amp to amplify the signal. But even with that, I found the end result to be somewhat underwhelming, especially with regards to volume levels. I thought it was a bit quiet, and I really didn't like the low-pass filtering that it had, because it was actually at a very high cutoff frequency, and my ears are sensitive to high frequencies. So
Mine too, actually. I get in arguments with friends that are in bands and my old bandmates all the time because I could actually hear high frequency noise that they can't. So we'll have, I mean, it's, for people that don't understand this, let me just pause this for a second. For anybody that doesn't understand what that's like, imagine if you and I are having a discussion and you're like, Bob, the monkey is on your shoulder. And I'm like, what do you mean? There's no monkey. And you're like, dude, there's a fucking monkey on your shoulder. And I like, it's that extreme. Like, people with a higher range of frequency of hearing could literally hear things that other people cannot. So when you try to have these conversations with them, it's very much like that, like the monkey reference. Like, they can't hear it, so they either just believe you and say, okay, I guess I can't hear it, or they think you're nuts. So imagine trying to have this conversation. They can't understand it. It's hard, you know?
it's like with a CRT. If there's a 15 kilohertz CRT just next to me, I can hear the high-pitched noise very clearly, and it actually gets very irritating after a while.
Yeah, me too, except I'm just so used to hearing it. It's like bad parents and their screaming kids. They just ignore it because they're just so used to hearing it all day.
Yeah.
So I can tune it right out. It's almost like a white noise for me. But I'm sorry, continue the crystal clear audio mod.
Yeah, so I had mentioned the gain that was rather low, plus the filtering because of the fairly high cutoff frequency, and especially I find that the YM2612 and YM3438 are actually very harsh with little to no low-pass filtering. Actually, you can't get away with using no low-pass filtering at all because the chip sample rate is 53 kilohertz, but there's still a lot of high-frequency garbage past that, which needs to be filtered out, otherwise you just get distorted garbage.
Yeah, I think Rene ran into a lot of the same things when designing his FM Power Base, or FM Power Base Mini. I'm probably saying that wrong, I'm sorry, Rene.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how his circuit is done. I've only analyzed the Japanese master system, which, quite frankly, is a bit meh, mostly because of the op-amp used, but I personally don't mind it as much.
So I recently just posted a very quick and dirty, YouTube compression killing comparison between the Japanese master system, the FM Power Base Mini, and the EverDrive FPGA based FM sound emulation. And I very much preferred. I actually thought the FM Power Base Mini was the best, but I preferred the ones that had the correct low pass filtering on it. Correct. I mean, it's my opinion.
Well, I don't actually think that there's low-pass filtering per se on the master system. It sounds more like high-pass filtering.
Right. So on the Japanese master system, whatever they do, I could, I like it. I'm not saying it's bad, but I could hear the harshness of it. And a lot of other people probably don't have the same, insane mutant hearing.
Right.
They said they liked it. So it's kind of interesting to see.
I like it too, but it seems like depending on the LM350, even between different LM358s, you could get different levels of crackling with the Japanese master system.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great way to put it. Crackling. Yeah. So.
Yeah, but even then, I had noticed, because my colleague who worked on the Mega Amp with me, Villahead94, he had actually done some experiments with the YM2413 in that console, and what he had found, and what I had noticed when he was sent me samples was, between different op-amps, TD-A1308, LM358, what I had noticed was that the LM358 tended to amplify the high frequencies a fair bit and made them sound a lot more harsh.
Well, there is one thing. I definitely want to continue down this road, but the one difference between audio and video is audio can very much reach a point where it's preference-based. Whereas when you're talking about video signals, you put it on an oscilloscope, and there's a tolerance range for each, for each color in RGBS, for the correct voltage outputs, for composite.
That's exactly right.
That's exactly right. Yeah, so while you could talk about, well, I like to turn the brightness and sharpness up on my TV, you can't talk about video levels. I mean, it's ones and zeros. It has to fall in with the tolerance.
Right. You have your specific specs. You have to stick within tolerances for that.
Exactly, but with audio, it's really, I mean, that's why there's
it's just purely subjective. It's purely subjective, like with retro PCs, that different sound cards will have different levels of filtering, because those also have FM synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are very heavily filtered, and others have none whatsoever, or almost none. I personally tend to go for the more filtered ones, like the Sound Blaster Pro, because that one actually has a low-pass filter that I personally like, since it muffles the sound to a degree where it doesn't actually hurt my ears over time.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So that, I guess, the crystal clear audio mod and wanting to add your own revisions, that's probably, I'm assuming, what drove you to make the Mega. So what, the Mega audio amp, the Mega amp?
The Mega amp.
Mega amp.
Yeah.
Okay.
The so main driving factor. Yeah, it gets a bit confusing. The main idea, though, with the Mega amp was because the crystal clear audio mod was not designed for the YM2612.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually got into several arguments about which chip is actually what was intended to be put in the Genesis, and I will continue to argue that it's the YM2612, especially when you see board revisions VA2 and VA2.3 on the Genesis Model 2.
Mm-hmm.
Because the ASIC in there was not actually designed by Yamaha. Unlike other Genesis models, it was actually Toshiba who made those. And I would assume that possibly Yamaha didn't want to give their FM core to Toshiba, so what Toshiba did to work around that was to just use an external YM2612, and specifically the YM2612, because there is a discrete version of the YM3438. But if that was really what Sega intended to use from the get-go, one would think that Sega would have stuck with the YM2612, not the YM2612, the YM3438.
So the only thing I'm going to add to that, now I've never interviewed anybody from Sega, I don't have any inside info, but out of the research I've done and out of all of the patterns that I've seen, I've come to the assumption, so assumptions or whatever, take it as you will, that all of the choices Sega made were in the moment choices based on what they needed to do that day. So I don't think there was ever an original plan of this is what the Genesis should be. I have a feeling that every time a new revision came about, it's like, well, what do you do about the audio chip? Fucking glue it in, come on. We're gonna make 100,000 of these, do it. So
it would seem that way until you consider the manufacturing process between the A6 and the YM2612 and YM3438, because the A6 are CMOS, the YM3438 is CMOS, the YM2612 is NMOS.
Good point.
So going by that, I would think that it would make more sense, at least in terms of cost, to just directly integrate a YM3438.
Yeah, very good point.
Although at the same time, the DAC was changed in the chip. And the example I keep bringing up is Afterburner 2, which that one makes very heavy use of the DAC noise. And if you were to run it on a console with a YM3438, it sounds incredibly dry.
Interesting.
Because it seems like it's the background notes that make use of the DAC noise the most. And they're very clear on a Genesis with a YM2612. But if it has a YM3438, they're somewhat muted. They're just background instruments that are barely audible.
So I'm leaving a note for myself for this. Do you have audio examples of this?
I do have an archive of samples. Not on this computer. I have it on my main PC off screen.
I'm just going to leave a note, and I'm going to punch in and interrupt this interview when we... actually, you know what? Let me just do this right now. Alright, so I just punched in the audio samples that Ace sent me so you guys could hear for yourself the difference. I'll post the links down below because YouTube compression screws with everything, but that's I never knew that. That's awesome. I'm so glad we get to hear that. So, but yeah, so I mean, how did you figure that out? Just over and over of using different board revisions, and all of a sudden you just heard it and went, holy crap, why is this different?
It was, at first I wasn't exactly sure what was the deal with the difference, but over time with experience and also learning through CJEP in Quebec and university now, it made me understand exactly what it is that, at least with regards to degraded audio quality with certain board revisions, particularly the VA7 Genesis Model 1 and pretty much every Genesis since then, it boils down really to Sega's obsession, really, with using a second-order low-pass filter, which what that does is it actually, the order is really how harsh the filter is, pretty much how steep your roll-off is from the cutoff point onwards, which is basically, a first order is a relatively shallow drop in frequency amplitude, but the higher the order, the steeper it gets.
Gotcha.
And the thing, too, is that the second-order filter has a relatively low cutoff frequency. I don't remember off the top of my head what it is, but I remember it's somewhere in the 1,000 kilohertz range, but something maybe around 6,000. I don't exactly remember. I'd have to recalculate that.
So when I first started realizing there were audio differences, I happened to have a Genesis that was, one of the earlier ones that say high-definition graphics with that EXT port and back that no one in America ever used. And it sounds, I mean, I still have it. It sounds amazing. It's exactly what I remember Genesis sounding like. Excuse me. And then I got a CDX, and the audio in that was absolutely god-awful. And then I got a Genesis 3... and the audio was good. So I put up that comparison online, and I got reamed for it because people say that CDX audio is awesome. There's got to be something wrong with my CDX, which is very, very plausible.
I don't think it's your CDX because even mine doesn't sound very good. The filtering on it is very, very weird. And on top of that, the volume is among the lowest of any Genesis variant I've ever come across.
Mm-hmm.
And to add to that, the XI sounds pretty much about the same.
Gotcha.
It doesn't sound very good. Its volume is very low, and the headphone amp seems to bass boost.
Yes.
But it doesn't really sound that good. It's just like...
I don't think so either, no.
No, and the op-amp setup that JVC used is an absolute mess. I mean, it's just dual op-amps everywhere. Nothing makes sense. And it's just cascaded through so many different stages. You just look at it and you think to yourself, what is this? Because it's just so damn messy for an end result that is underwhelming.
Yeah, I completely agree. And
it's the same deal with the VA7 of VA7 Genesis Model 1 and VA0 to VA1.8 Genesis Model 2, which is a 3-stage setup that doesn't even work very well, especially because of op-amp choice.
So your Mega Amp can be installed in all of those to restore the original sound of it, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, it's on my list of things to do is to put that in my CDX, actually, because I'm really looking forward to seeing the biggest difference. So how will that affect Afterburner 2 then?
That's actually not down to the amplifier, that's down to the FM chip, and the CDX uses the ASIC integrated YM3438. So you won't be hearing the background notes that well. And on top of that, when you move to GOAC designs, like with the VA4 Genesis Model 2 and the Genesis 3, those YM3438s are further altered, where the DAC noise is actually even less pronounced. And on top of that, the volume is lower overall. But what I noticed as well with the YM3438 while designing the Mega Amp and also comparing GOAC-based Gena clones, it seems as if the YM3438, if you don't buffer the signal first, you need to use very high resistance between the chip's outputs and the input to your amplifier, because it looks to source a lot of current, and being as it's a CMOS device, it sources current rather than sync like the YM2612. So what ends up happening is when you have too little resistance, and most clones will go with 10 k ohms series resistance, that ends up distorting mostly low-frequency sounds as well as anything using PCM audio. So what I found was, at least for the ASIC model, you need about 51 kiloohms or something like that, as well as about 33 for the GOAC version. And even on top of that, on the ASIC YM3438, I noticed that, I'm not sure if it's a voltage drop or current limiting, I didn't actually take measurements. The power pins are not directly connected to 5 volts or ground, except on the XI, whereas on Sega's original systems, what I noticed was that earlier systems had about 1 k ohm resistors on 5 volts and ground, which was then dropped to 560 ohms. And that seems to alter the voltage. I'm not sure if it's to the DAC or the digital section, but it does alter the volume because the chip doesn't get as much voltage through. At least that's what I would assume.
Huh. Weird. Could you explain a little bit, because the question I get all the time is how come you could put a SPDIF, Toslink, whatever you want to call it, the digital audio output on a SNES, but not a Genesis?
From what I can tell, the Genesis doesn't have actually any real place to get digital audio from, at least not I2S audio, because if you look at the Super NES sound hardware, there is an I2S DAC connected to it, so you could just tap directly into the I2S signals. But on a Genesis, there's no such thing. You would basically you can't do that because the DAC is integrated within the YM2612 and YM3438. So all you have is analog audio. Right.
Gotcha. And also because there's multiple sound sources going into the output amp, right?
That's correct, yeah, because you've got the YM2612 or YM3438. You have an SN76489, which is the carryover from the master system. That's just split to dual mono. You've got auxiliary audio from the Sega CD slot, plus auxiliary audio from the cartridge slot, which is where the 32X passes its audio into the mix.
So, all right, let's put the 32X on hold, but I want to come back to that for a second. So, your Mega Audio amp, is that an open source design? Is that something you sell?
I don't sell it yet. I do have a PCB design that I do need to correct because I just earlier in the year released the Mega Amp 2.0, which is correcting pretty much things that I thought were a bit limited with the original Mega Amp. I had some complaints about Sega CD pass-through on this Model 2 Sega CD not working anymore. And I wasn't exactly satisfied with the gain I was getting out of the circuit. The volume levels were matching later Genesis revisions, but I couldn't get it as loud as the Genesis Model 1 because the op-amp I'm using, which is the TL074, doesn't seem to have enough voltage swing, so what ends up happening is the entire waveform just gets chopped off, and you end up with distorted audio, which is actually the issue with early Genesis Model 1s. Specifically, we got the VA2 board revision first in North America, but Japan had VA0 and VA1 prior. Those ones have an issue with their preamp. The gain is actually too high, and inside the CXA 1034 headphone amp, there's actually a fixed gain amplifier for that, for the headphone out. But because the preamp is so loud, the audio ends up getting garbled, especially for games that are either loud or bass heavy.
Yeah, it's almost like it's clipping a little bit.
It is, because it goes beyond the capacities of the internal amp. And that was something that was corrected with the VA3 revision, which kept going until VA 6.8, but VA 7 was when the entire audio design just went down the pan.
So Mega Amp version 2.0 really corrects all of that as well. So if you install that in any version of the Genesis, then you get pretty much the proper audio. You
do, and you've also got the Sega CD pass-through with the Pro version, which that one's a more complex design that is actually based off Sega's original, rather lackluster design from the VA7 Genesis Model 1 onwards to the VA 1.8 Genesis Model 2, because that's a case of right idea, wrong execution, in that there is first mixing of the internal audio of the Genesis plus the 32X. At the first stage, it then splits off between the Sega CD expansion slot and the final amplifier that delivers the audio to the DIN on the console. Right, so that is definitely something I want to talk to you next about. Hold on, it's I'm usually drinking beer on these, but I got my wife's coffee mug, and now I'm switching to Diet Pepsi. What a rebel. So the integration of 32X and Sega CD audio is something I've argued a lot about over the years, because Sega's instructions are impossible to decipher. It's like freaking hieroglyphics, the original Sega CD instructions. And so many people think that you have to run that audio cable out and into the 3.5 jack and everything. And I've done every audio capture that I could think of, even with, was the CDDA audio? I'm probably getting that wrong, but... CDDA. So can you explain how the audio pass-through works, and maybe in technical terms why you don't need that jumper? Because people still insist that you need it, but I've never found that you do, at least in the Model 1 Genesis and Sega. Well, you actually don't. The thing is, if you were to look at the schematics for the Genesis Model 1, there is an audio path from the Sega CD expansion slot to the internal amplifier, where the Sega CD audio gets mixed in with everything else. That pass-through cable isn't really necessary unless you want to, say, hook it up to a sound system or something. And that was the conclusion I came to, is that Sega just wanted to market this as, you know, hey, it's $200, but look at, you have a high-end CD player that you could put directly into your, you know, your AVR at home. So that's what it would seem. But with the Model 2 Genesis, they actually have an output to the Sega CD, because it actually has an input on the Model 2. The Model 1 doesn't have this, but the Model 2 has an extra input on the expansion slot, where the audio from the Genesis gets mixed in with the audio from the Sega CD and gets output through the RCA connectors. Huh. Interesting. So is that the issue you were having with the Mega Amp then? That was the thing, because that split was not there. And that's only an issue with the Genesis 2 Sega CD 2? That's correct. So 32X audio, from what I've gathered, the 32X has the ability to create its own audio. Most games don't, but either way, it's all done internally on the Genesis. That little jumper cable on the outside only passes RGBS over to the 32X, correct? It passes mono audio as well. Does it? But here's the thing. The 32X audio is actually mixed inside the Genesis, but is then redirected through the DIN at the 32X's RGB input.
Interesting.
And if you were to use a straight Genesis Model 1 patch cable adapter with the patch cable for the Genesis Model 2, you just get mono audio because there's no stereo from the DIN. But if you get a custom patch cable that takes the audio from the headphone out, that's what gets redirected to the stereo pins. And you can then get that out from the output DIN on the 32X.
Gotcha. So that's what I've been recommending since day one on the website. And in fact, I even recommend cables that have a female DIN connector on it, so that you're essentially converting your Genesis 1's output to a Genesis 2, so you only need one RGB SCART cable.
Right, just a direct connection from the Genesis to the 32X, and just stick a 9-pin SCART cable onto the 32X's output.
Right, so it actually, in this case, you would need 2 jumpers, and the purpose is for anybody that wants to play Virtua Racing or Master System games, you can't pass it through the 32X, so the only choice is to buy 2 RGB SCART cables, or 2 jumper cables, or a jumper cable and an adapter. So that's the ones that I always recommend, and I just, it's so hard to explain to people without the visuals on the website, but it does make it infinitely easier for me, so...
Well, you do have to admit, though, that Sega just made a complete mess out of the whole situation. Just already the 3 power supplies is just excessive.
Right, and they're not even. They didn't even include like what would have made sense is if you bought the 32X and it came with a higher end power supply with like a bunch of pigtails so that you could plug all 3 devices together. But
that's what would make sense.
3 gigantic freaking bricks that you got to figure out how to plug in. So.
What I say is get a slim PlayStation 2 power supply and make a plug adapter on it that splits off the output, because that thing is rated for, I've seen some rated for 4.5 amps, and others that are over 5 amps at 8.5 volts. So those would power everything. And I'm not a fan of switching supplies because of their noise, but Sony made a really good one for the PlayStation 2. So you could actually just get away with that, and you put less strain on your regulators, because it's not like a linear power supply in that the voltage is higher than what's rated on the brick itself. Especially when there's no load on a power supply that's of the linear variety. You get very high voltage, like say a Genesis power supply, I put a meter to it, it measures 14 volts with no load, and then it dropped to say 12, something like that. Which a 7805 can handle, but it still makes it generate a lot more heat.
There are, it's confusing because there's a bunch of 3-in-1 power supplies out there for sale. There's a few good ones, there's a few terrible ones. Steve from HD Retrovision actually tested a whole bunch, and he found one that you can get on Amazon for like $12. That's good, and it's UL certified, which means it's probably more consistent than others. But he tested it, and I've been running that on all my consoles just to see, and I haven't had any noise on the video line. Well, any more noise than you would expect on the video lines. So I'll leave a link in the description for that one too if anybody's interested. He's got adapters for everything. So, and then while it still is, a brick on the end, it's small. Like you could fit a couple next to each other. So that's another good alternative too. That way, the Sony power supply might be better, but at least you're gonna have to hack up a PS2 power supply.
Well, you don't necessarily have to hack it up. If you get the correct tip that plugs to the end, you could then wire in the necessary tips for the Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X.
Good point. All you need is the tip adapter. I have such a hard time finding those because every time I feel like I found the right ones, I get them home and they're too tight, they're a little bit too loose, they're all, just a hair off, and I don't know if my measurements are wrong or if just the tolerances in these cheap adapters are wrong. So, they run 100,000 through a manufacturing process, and the
I'm
ones
not
at the
sure,
beginning
but
are tighter than the ones at the end.
I'm not sure, but I actually have a hard time, at least locally, finding tips for those yellow barrel power supply tips.
Yeah, I find most of them on eBay or from Asian sellers in Hong Kong or China or something. I can't really find them. I haven't found them, at least in the U.S. or for U.S. sellers.
Yeah, I don't know online, but at least locally in Canada, at least Montreal, I haven't found anything.
So on the video side of things, the most common fix for the Genesis jail bars on models that it works is either removing the composite video line, separating the subcarrier frequencies and all that stuff. Have you found a model motherboard that's consistently better than the rest, because Mark from My Life in Gaming insists that his stock Genesis is perfect and needs no mods at all, and I've never found that ever. Every Genesis I've ever used has some kind of jail bars or
That's what I've noticed too. Subcarrier noise on pretty much every Genesis over RGB, but I did notice at least the VA7, unless it's just this particular one, seems to be slightly darker than the rest.
Yeah, I definitely recommend that, if people want the absolute best quality out of their Genesis, to do some kind of modification or bypass to it. And there's two in the works now that are taking kind of forever because the guys that are making them are a bit perfectionists. But, Voltar's got one where it bypasses the signal to the CXA chip that's already in that motherboard. So you're essentially using what's already there. You're just separating all of the signals from the board to try to remove any chance of interference. And then Renee's got one using that newer THS 7374 amp, and that completely takes everything off the board. And there's absolutely advantages to both, but the amount of variance in Genesis motherboards is a little staggering. And I'll put up in the picture now, but if you want to pull up some of the ones that I sent you so you could look at what I'm looking at. So I'm friends with Wes, the guy who hosts the Second Opinion Games podcast. And when I was first experimenting with Genesis bypasses, he said, hey, I have my Genesis from when I was a kid. Do you want to do it to that one? Because, I think he had issues with it. So the first thing that I noticed is there was just a random screw in the bottom of it, which I'd never seen before. So I was kind of, took a little pause before opening it and went, this is a little strange. So then I saw, right before I actually cracked it open, it looked like somebody had drilled holes in the bottom corner for whatever crazy reason. And this is obviously not something done with a factory machine. It looks like somebody took a little drill and just went bzz, bzz, bzz.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking when I saw that picture.
Yeah, and I called him. I was like, dude, before I open this up, did you do an experiment when you were a kid? Did you try to modify your Genesis? And he's like, no, it's the one my parents bought. It's like, oh, okay, I'll open it up and see. And then, that last picture, I'm putting it up right now for everybody watching. Yeah, here we go. Holy crap.
Heat sinks galore on that thing.
Yeah, so it looks like people took pieces of metal and bent it over and then cut it to fan it out so there's more more surface area and more air dispersion. But that is supposedly a VA2 motherboard from the factory. Have you ever seen anything like that?
Not in the slightest. I have never seen anything that just had this ridiculous amount of heat sinks on it. As I was saying before we started, I had just gotten an Xi that someone had put heat sinks on the ASIC and the CPU, but that was about it. I've never seen something with this many heat sinks just tossed on top of everything.
Yeah, it blew my mind. I opened it up and I just, I kind of took a couple of pictures and then I started to think, all right, well, maybe I could just try something or, maybe, and I called Wes. I was like, I can't touch this thing, man. Either somebody went home, modified their Genesis, and then returned it to Toys R Us or wherever he got it from, or this was a weird experiment in the factory that they said, oh, well, screw it, let's just throw it on the assembly line and send it out to the customer. They'll never notice. But I've never seen anything like this before.
I don't know what to say to this. This is just ridiculous.
I had to show you that because out of all the motherboard revisions you've seen, I was wondering if maybe you'd stumbled across something like this before and had some odd explanation. But I think maybe it was a prototype.
I got nothing
thrown into the assembly line. But
that's what it would seem just by the looks of it, because I've never seen any heat sinks in the Genesis except on the 7805s.
Right. Yeah. Oof.
Although VA0 boards from very early Japanese Mega Drives produced in 1988 actually have an entire circuit board with discrete logic sitting on top of the 315, 50, 313 VDP, which that is actually the ED clock generator.
Right, so what I have seen, absolutely, and many revisions of the Genesis, are random wires soldered across the motherboard. So it looked like factory fixes, where, you know, somebody would solder a connection, fix a trace, something like that. Have you seen those?
I've seen so many Genesis systems that are like that, and on those early VA zeros, actually, I think because of timing issues, the ED clock generator actually causes at least red zone to consistently glitch and reset itself.
Jeez.
I haven't found any other game like that, but that one is especially weird. And on the VA1 board, they actually integrated it into a little custom chip that's just under the VDP, which you can see on that VA2 picture is actually the, let me zoom in here, as I don't remember the part number on top of my head, the 315/50/345.
Gotcha.
That little dip down between the Z80 and the 315/50/313.
Yeah, Nick from HD Retrovision was talking about how when he was a kid, he had a Zenith TV. If anybody remembers those, they generally were the gigantic ones that looked like pieces of furniture. But he said his Genesis wouldn't work on it, and he sent it back to the factory, and there was actually a factory mod that they did to it. Or he sent it to Sega, and there was a factory mod to make it work with the Zenith TVs, I believe because of the timing. He talked about it on the last Retro Roundtable podcast, so...
Yeah, I do think that the V-Sync on the Genesis is not quite 59.94 or 60 hertz. I think it's a little below that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but there is a weird quirk that I had noticed, at least with how the XRGB Mini handles the Sega System C2, which is an arcade PCB based off the Genesis hardware, but using the digital video bus on the 315/50/313 rather than the analog video out. There's an extra DAC connected to it. For some reason, it seems to see the refresh rate as being considerably higher than what you would get on a Genesis, and I end up with every half second it skips a frame or two.
Huh. So the one thing that I've definitely seen a lot is I have a whole bunch of those Extron boxes just because I find them to be really handy for testing and wiring stuff together. And they'll tell you the refresh rate on their little LCD screen. And very, very often, they don't detect the Genesis signal at all. So if you manually set it to that input, it'll pass it through and work. But the refresh rate's definitely, on at least some model Genesis, whatever, off by a hair. And it does have weird effects on certain equipment.
It's the same thing like if you were to take off sync lock on an XRGB Mini, you'd get screen tearing with the Genesis and even a Master System.
Yeah, well, the Master System doesn't... oh, God, I think I'm going to screw this up. So the horizontal sync slices, I think it's not in the signal. So the Master System, even if you play Master System games through a Genesis, on many monitors, you'll actually see, like, in the upper corner, it'll distort the picture to one side. And it's a strange thing. I'm talking to somebody about possibly making a box that regenerates the horizontal sync slices so that you make everything compatible with all displays.
I actually noticed that too with the, believe it or not, I actually noticed that with the Super NES a little bit. Sometimes if I were to put the brightness too high, you'd see that the top of the screen would sort of lighten a little bit and then warp a little to the side. But it was only when I was getting a white picture, when it was an all-white screen, and it didn't matter if it was composite, S-Video, or RGB.
What model SNES were you using?
SHVC CPU01, the very first board revision.
Interesting. Okay. Because the one chips from the factory are definitely too bright, and adding the resistors, the pull-down resistors, change the signal in a way where it actually is sharper. It's dimmer as a result, obviously, but it's not as washed out. So if you were using a one chip, I would suggest adding those just to see what happens. But the
I do actually have. I have a one chip big Super NES. Plus Super Famicom Junior and Super NES Mini. Although the Super NES Mini is what I have modded for RGB. I don't have the Super Famicom Junior modded. I don't plan on modding that one specifically. There are some systems that I absolutely will not accept any mods on because those are what I consider as reference systems for things when I compare clones or software emulation.
Gotcha. Yeah, I've over the years that I've been working on the site, I've seen so many bad mods come across my desk that it's really, like, it's made me upset. So I will do anything possible to not cut any plastic, and almost every one of the mods I do are fully reversible. So even like the SNES one chip, the big ones, the RGB bypass, if you wanted to put that back, all you have to do is remove that board, put back like 4 little surface mount components that are 10 cents each, and that's it. You have a 100%, you know, back to the way it was, stock one chip. So
yeah, you should. I've seen my fair share of crap as well, but even things, because I do repairs too. Mm-hmm. I've seen some absolutely filthy systems that look like they were left out in a shed. I mean, I had once an NES caked in dead flies inside.
Oh yeah, we've seen a lot of those. Michael from Badass Consoles and I will trade horror pictures every now and then when we get one.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's had one covered in cockroaches.
Yeah. Oh god, I got a PlayStation 3 like that once. Ugh. Whenever I see that sort of thing, and I absolutely despise bugs, if I see that kind of filth, I just toss that aside and let someone else clean it, because I ain't touching that shit.
Yeah, it's a little creepy. I've seen some weird stuff, definitely. But
yeah, nothing beats, and this is what I had seen in a slim PlayStation 3. I have literally no clue how they managed to do this. They shoved 4 DVDs into the drive, stacked on top of one another, and somehow it didn't damage anything.
I wonder. That sounds like a little kid. That sounds like a kid just jamming stuff in.
I don't know. I have seen that with a Wii, because I saw a toy accessory and even a 3DS game cartridge in the DVD drive of in the optical drive of a Wii.
That's pretty funny. A 3DS cartridge. Jeez.
Yeah, and it didn't even have a label on it. So it was just a mystery cartridge, and I don't think I had a 3DS at the time.
So how did you get started in all this stuff? I mean, you're certainly a wealth of information of all these things. You know, did you just find one and decide that you liked it a lot?
No, it was just actually what got me into this was just looking up just hardware in general. I mean, what got me started was actually was reading up on reliability issues with the front loader NES cartridge slot, mm-hmm. and the 10 NES lockout chip wreaking havoc with the consistent reset loops. And at the time, the only NES I had was my father's old NES that he says he got somewhere in the mid-'80s. It was actually a fairly early system. And I did check the board revisions. Actually, NES CPU 03 inside. It's a relatively early system. But that one still has the original slot. It still works. The cartridge slot has not been tightened. The 10 NES chip has not been disabled. But my lord, is the video quality atrocious on it.
Yeah.
And I think there's something off with the video circuit, because I've seen a video of the early test batch NES CPU 01 board revision that was from the batch sold in New York. Mm-hmm. And it had the same video problems where the gamma levels looked very weird. The whites were very bright. Everything else was stupidly dark. The video was incredibly blurry. And hue shifted as well.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. And from messing around with a Famiclone video circuit, what I had seen was that if you were to put a capacitor to ground right after the PNP transistor buffer, if that capacitor has too much capacitance, it actually causes a hue shift. And I would assume that's what Nintendo did with those early revisions, because I don't remember that with NES CPU 04 to NES CPU 11.
So, oh god, was it revisions 7 and 8 are supposedly the best for the NES?
What Voltar was telling me was 09, and that's actually my personal NES, 09. Which is actually the reference system I have, and that's the one that no mods are allowed on.
Oh yeah, well, it would make sense. Yeah, it might have been 09. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head here.
Yeah, but he was saying about an NES CPU 11 having pretty bad vertical lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had an 11 come my way lately, although I don't remember actually paying attention to that.
Yeah, I have a PlayChoice 10 NES that I don't know why. It's one of the few things that's kind of useless that I just love that I own. You know, and it was modded by Jason from Game Tech. He did an amazing job. Everything's great in it, but I kind of wanted to clean it up and redo it a little bit, just because I love knowing that I have like an official, unofficial NES with RGB output. You know, it's an actual chip, and it's so stupid. I know, but whatever. I there's very few things I have that I collect. Everything else I either use, like I play games on, or I use for research on the website. But that's one thing that I don't ever want to get rid of. I just, you know, I've seen a lot of hack jobs, but this is not it. This is like a really nice PlayChoice 10, and Voltar keeps trying to tell me to get, it must be the revision 9 board, to try to make it even better, because mine had almost no jail bars, which is pretty shocking for a PlayChoice 10 NES. So
yeah, because I had inserted a 2C05 into a HVC CPU 07 revision Famicom, vertical lines everywhere.
Yeah.
And that was just with the THS 7314 doing amplification. But it seems as if, and that was the first thing I noticed with that, is the output is actually very heavily saturated, and the whites were somewhat dark. And I had noticed, at least with 75 ohm resistors, the voltage, when I was putting a white line test pattern with the 240p test suite, it didn't seem to hit 1 volt peak to peak.
So, but you were, I mean, if you're talking about your dad's NES, were you a kid when you started messing with all this stuff?
I was 14, actually, in 2006.
So, yeah, a kid. Did your dad have an oscilloscope or something, and that's how you're able to mess with all this?
No, the oscilloscope was actually, the CJEP I was attending was ridding their old equipment right when I completed the 3-year program I was in. And I ended up taking home an oscilloscope and even a test pattern generator for calibrating CRTs. Oh,
those are... I actually used one of those for the first time the other day.
I would actually have to use it on this TV behind me, which is a KV30HS 420 HD2, because the geometry on this thing, calibrating it is an absolute freaking nightmare, and I'm really losing my patience with it.
My cousin Scott has a similar model to that, and it's... he spent like 2 hours, and he got it good, but it's still off.
Yeah, my main issue is on this corner. It seems to pinch near the middle.
Yep.
For the most part. And the biggest issue I have, though, is pin cushion adjustment, because I always end up where the middle of the screen is either straight and everything on the edge tends to bow outwards, or just the other way around. It just squeeze inwards in the middle, and on the side it just be perfectly straight.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pain, but... So, geez, you were just, you know, you just kind of started messing with it. Did you do just research online, you know, bring the scope home and start poking around?
Actually, it was a while before I used the scope. It was when I was starting to do arcade PCB repair work, which that still I haven't managed to get off the ground that much, because my first attempt was actually on the Konami Life Force PCB that I had just picked up broken. And that thing actually went up in smoke for no apparent reason.
Jeez.
Just it's a 2 PCB sandwich where you got the logic, most of the logic on top and the video boards on the bottom. It ended up, the bottom board actually just ended up smoking near one of the custom Konami chips. It burned a hole through the board. The chip is still working even with a damaged pin, but now it's just showing up scrambled garbage.
Jeez.
And even now I have a really obnoxious R-Type 2 board that just, I don't know what is its problem. I can't get it to get past the power on test. It just keeps locking up to a RAM error of some sort.
So I am by no means an expert, nor do I ever pretend to be, but whenever I've traced out problems like that, the things that I see often are leaky capacitors damaging traces, and it could be, you know, 5 or 6 traces very close to each other, and only one is damaged, so it's kind of hard to see. And
that wasn't the case.
I've seen RAM chips just go bad on all types of things.
That I've seen, because at least on the daughter board that's on it with the video ROMs, or at least I think they're the video ROMs, some of the RAM actually had floating pins on it. And they were the address lines, from what I remember. They were showing nothing on my scope, nothing on my logic probe either.
Yeah, okay, bad RAM chips.
Yeah, but even then, even the logic chips that were connected to them were getting stupidly hot very fast. So those were likely internally shorted.
Jeez. You know, it's what you get when we deal with hardware that's...
Yeah,
you know,
and what doesn't help either is that there are no schematics to the R-Type 2 PCB except for a partial one around the CPU area that doesn't really help me at all. And all I have as extra reference is a Hammer and Harry PCB that uses the same bottom, but the top is slightly different. Even
Gotcha.
with that, if I were to have a second R-Type 2 board that actually works, that would help, were it not for the fact that it costs a stupid amount of money to actually get one.
Yeah, so I'm always a fan of using original hardware, and FPGA, emulation. I think we've done right is absolutely how these things are going to live on. But the one thing that I absolutely love software emulation for is arcade stuff, just because it's so hard to fix and keep these things running and expensive, and it's hard to find the room to store all this stuff.
So one of the worst PCBs I've seen is anything based on Konami's Bubble System board.
Oh yeah,
because that's not actually ROMs in the proper sense of a ROM chip. It's using bubble memory. So basically, I think it's some sort of magnetic storage. Those things tend to go bad over time, and Konami actually had so many reliability issues that they converted the games to use ROMs.
Weird.
Except those, I have a Gradius PCB like that, of the Bubble System variety. I could never get it to work. It uses 4 voltages because of the bubble memory. Because it needs 5 volts for the logic, it needs 12 volts for the audio amp, and it needs -5 and -12 as well for the bubble memory.
That's wow. What a complicated design. I wonder what the reasonings were for doing something like that.
I don't know. I think the base idea was really to have one main PCB and just interchangeable games, because the bubble memory cartridges are actually connected via a ribbon cable to the motherboard.
Nuts.
It was a really stupid system, and they ended up. That is actually so problematic that you can't even emulate it properly. It's just the ROM version of Gradius that's emulated, which that one doesn't actually run the same way, because with the slower access times on the bubble memory, you have the game actually has to warm up before it starts. Because bubble memory is a specific operating temperature, and there is a heating element, which I think is just a big resistor.
So that's some technology that maybe that's what we had. So I used to, my first corporate IT job, I was 19, and it was at Brinks Home Security, and they had been there since the 70s. And the guy, the network administrator, had been there since the 70s, and I kind of, I was 19, he was 68 or something. The dude taught me more in the 3.5 years that I worked there than than the previous 10 years of my life, I guess. But one of the things he was telling me about is they had a system where they said, okay, you have to run this at an exact constant temperature. And, it could be, it was actually a very wide temperature tolerance, but it can't really vary more than about a degree or two at any time while it's running, or else you'll get errors. So this is early 80s. And he said, so, they were talking about different refrigeration systems, they were talking about everything else. And he's like, well, why don't we just use an oven? What are you, crazy? The temperature tolerances are almost up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Why don't we just get an oven and set it at 130? It's never going to get 130 in this room. Everybody's like, no, that's never going to work. Sure as shit, they had that running for a while. They got it. They used it to do whatever data transfer they were doing. So they had an oven carried in there. It was there for a couple of months. I thought that was the coolest thing in the world.
That's actually pretty funny, and I would assume that is something based on bubble memory, but yeah. I don't think that the rest of the integrated circuits would probably take too kindly to that kind of heat.
No, he was actually talking about how he had to put that one module into the oven and then isolate it so it wasn't, touching.
Oh well, if it was just if it was just a basic bubble memory module with no logic on it, well, in that instance, it would make sense.
Yeah, that's hysterical. I love that. That same company, right? We got. I guess they had a situation where the senior VP told the secretary, like, hey, this is an Excel spreadsheet that has the safe data for all of the individual offices around, I think, the world, actually. So don't put this on the shared drive. Only keep it on your computer because, we can't let this information out. Which makes sense and doesn't. So this was late 90s, early 2000s, so I get it. Security wasn't as well educated out there. So her computer dies. So I swapped it out with another one, and I had kind of left it on the shelf. I was just a desktop support technician, and I hadn't touched it. I was busy with other stuff. And all of a sudden, the big boss, who was an ex-colonel in the military, and it was very, very scary guy if you weren't used to being around people like that. I was, so I didn't really care. But, he comes in, like, his face was white, and it's just, that PC that died had the safe info on it. Don't worry, it's not your fault. Did you erase it? I said, well, no, I think the hard drive's actually dead. Do you want me to take a look at it? No. So I heard through the, I'm 20 at this point. Maybe I was still 19. So I was definitely just the kid. They paid no attention to me whatsoever. So I thought, screw it. I read this whole article about why this one model of hard drive was dying. So I put it in an anti-static bag, and then I, wrapped it in something, and I left it in the freezer that night when we left. And then the next morning, I see all these people in that guy's office, and it's very stiff board meeting, and they were talking about sending a team of people out to go to each, imagine like the Secret Service with a briefcase, with the handcuffs on it type of thing, to go to each individual main office to check the safe data so that they could get the secure info and put it into a secure location. So I get in the that morning at like 7 a.m. I take the thing out of the freezer. I had a whole station set up, and then I put it right into the thing, turn it on, get it, copy the file, burn it to a CD, and I walked into the meeting. And this guy, this was a by the book, ex-colonel in the Marines thing, And I interrupted the meeting, and his face turned red. I thought he was going to kill me in front of the whole thing. And I was like, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but I know you guys are talking about the safe data. I think I got the file, but I didn't want to open it for obvious reasons. Here you go. And he was so mad. I thought, like, he was going back and forth between wanting to fire me right there and throw me out the window. And then he was embarrassed because it's like, why is this 19-year-old kid bringing me a CD? Why did we even call the meeting? And, about 2 minutes later, the whole team of guys walk out of the room past the computer room, and they're all kind of smirking at me. And the guy comes back in, and he's like, just tell me the next time you're going to do something like that. So I recovered the file just because the expanding and contracting of the metal, the needle had gotten stuck. So when I froze it, the metal moved, and then I put it right into the PC and unstuck, got the file back. I love
good old thermal expansion.
Yep, I love shit like that. That stuff makes me so happy. Just stupid little stories like that.
Yeah, that was a really good one, actually.
Yeah, I still can't believe that. Actually, I've told that story to a couple people, and they're like, "That didn't happen." I'm like, "Yeah, if I was gonna lie about something, it'd be something cooler than that." But I love that one.
Yeah, so, I think I don't even think someone who never even touched a computer would even be able to come up with something like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I've always been, I've never been an expert at anything, and I've never pretended to be, but I've always been like a good middleman. So like I've always been able to put different pieces together to come up with shit like that. So.
I don't claim myself to be an expert either. I'm still a university student. I don't have a degree yet.
Yeah, you don't need a degree to be an expert. It's nice, and it works.
Well, practical knowledge is really where it's at, but you need to at least have some of the theory behind it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, although sometimes I will say it does get a bit infuriating because it seems like they're always beating around the bush, just going around a bunch of useless bullshit.
Yeah, I have so many issues with that. So if I had gone to college in a different time period, 5 years earlier, 5 years after, maybe a little more, I think I would have a different perspective on this. But when I enrolled in college, the 4 or 5 that I was looking at, because I was the poor kid, I couldn't afford to go to a fancy school. And I hated high school, so I got whatever grades were good enough so I could pass and move on to the next year. I'd spend 2 minutes working on a homework assignment and screwing off. All of the colleges basically said, like, yeah, you won't even touch a computer until halfway through your senior year. We're going to give you these math, English, and science classes, and and nothing was theory, nothing was any of the interesting stuff. It was basically high school 2.0. And then I talked to different tech schools that were the opposite. They said, no, you do the hands-on stuff first, and then you go back and get your other education. And one was cheap and close to me. So I went to that, and I was learning stuff that I had been doing since I was a kid, since like before high school. Yeah. They were teaching us like Windows 3.1 stuff. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. Where's the theory? I want to learn the network topology layer, topography layer, and I want to learn the stuff behind it. And it was, do this first, then do your math and English, and then go back for that. So I just, as soon as I got a real job, I screwed right off and started just work. And then throughout the years, like, I'd find people. One guy had a master's degree in computer science with, I mean, every certification you can imagine. And I was, I think, 23 and he was 28 or something. And he comes in, and I was so excited to work with him because I was like, shit, this guy's going to know everything. Every time I have a question, I don't need to Google. I could just ask this guy. And he knew all of the theories. And if we needed code written to talk to any of the layers, he could do it. But when I started talking about, yeah, well, I'm just going to deploy, an image to those 4 computers over there, he just looked at me like, well, how are you going to do that? Well, we could use the imaging machine. I could use Ghost. I could send it over the network. Don't you have a fucking master's degree? So it's just, I think I hit college in the worst time for a computer person to do it. So I didn't find the school that I could get the groundwork to learn the back of this stuff, and none of them were good at the hands-on. So I just kind of figured my way through it, and I got lucky. I've had some amazing jobs and done some shit that I can't believe I pulled off, but. I do very much wish that things had fallen into place different so I could have some solid core knowledge of something. I mean, I know there's always time to go back, but you also...
Same deal with me when I was in CJEP. I had originally gone to a program that was pretty much nothing electronics, just a little bit of Java, and the rest was just math, physics, and chemistry, and that really got me so demotivated at one point that... I just said, the hell with this. I'm switching programs. And I did switch over. The program was in a bit of a crisis at the time because there were some teachers that students had actually complained about because we have to get internships at the end of the program for 3 weeks, and they weren't getting it. So they actually ended up filing complaints to the point where some teachers actually got suspended.
Oh, wow.
So from then on, the program was reworked. But it was actually through that I could have actually made the Mega Amp possible, because it was in my second year in the program that I had seen op amps for the first time. And from then on, it was just focus on this, because this is actually something that I want to get myself into.
I love hearing stuff like that, because you just stumble over and discover something and realize you like it. Because so many people at any age, if you say like, "Well, what do you really want to do?" They go, "I don't fucking know. I got this job. I keep doing it. Whatever." So it's so, I don't know. It's very fulfilling, I guess, is a good word to use, when you find something that you really enjoy and then you get to go do it.
Definitely, and there's more to it than just that. I like to build computers. I mean, modern PCs, retro computers. I especially have an interest in the older computers, especially because those are actually more hands-on when it comes to configuration. If you were to just get something new with, say, a Core i7 or a Ryzen, whatever, 357, whatever you want, that you just stick the CPU inside and the BIOS will auto-configure everything for you.
Yes, you don't have to set any jumpers. You don't have to look up a diagram.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that's actually what appeals to me with the older boards. Even though my main DOS Windows 9X gaming computer doesn't actually use those, except... no, actually, that's not true. There are dip switches for the front side bus frequency on it, which I'd actually probably desolder and put a switch, because I'm using this as a hybrid PC because it runs on an AMD K63 Plus. And what I discovered through YouTube channel Phil's Computer Lab was that you could actually alter the frequency of the K63 Plus through software and also through the front side bus with the dip switches and jumpers of your motherboard, so that you can make and also disable the internal cache to have it run anything between a 386 and Pentium 2 early Pentium 3 performance levels.
Wow, I didn't know that.
So you really have a big variety of DOS games, especially, that you could run, because some of them are timing sensitive.
People will never understand what it's like to have to, pre-Google. You have to have a driver on a 3.5-inch floppy drive. And then, once or twice in my life, I had something happen where I needed to reinstall the modem driver. and then it was the wrong driver. So then we had to get into a car and drive to somebody else's house who had a computer with a modem, and then sit there for an hour and download the 1 megabyte file, and then get back in the car and drive back to that person's house and hope that was the right driver. And if not, go back to that other. I mean, this is the days of like, I'm going to Google this on my cell phone and email it to myself, and then poof, there's the driver. You know, that's
not back then. Not back then. That was very impractical.
Yeah.
I mean, I wasn't around in the 80s to actually experience that, but
I think it was so I'm 36 now, so it was probably the early 90s. You know, whenever I had cousins that were old enough to have cars, I guess was so probably 94 or something. 95 was
I was still a young kid at the time.
Yeah, it's I love that I did get to go through that.
Yeah, I do kind of miss, though, at least the era of the transition from DOS to Windows 95, 98.
Mm-hmm.
I especially remember the dial-up modem that we used to have here.
Yeah, I remember those
Fun
too.
Stuff.
Yeah, I remember when I found those first like Juarez chat rooms, and I would leave my computer on overnight to download those things over the telephone line. And you know, if it was like 7 in the morning, and you know, my grandparents would pick up the phone to call for the weather. Remember, you used to have to do that, and they'd hear that.
What did I do with over the phone once? It was actually something that I had seen. There was I think a hotline or something regarding seasonal allergies that I had seen on TV when they were doing allergy reports, because my father and I are both allergic to ragweed, especially.
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to that time, especially me, I just have no energy. I pretty much don't care about anything, and I just want to sleep.
Yeah, that's
and on top of that, I get itchy as hell.
Oh, that sucks.
Yeah. It's especially in the mouth, and that is really not pleasant, I'll tell you that.
Oof. So, what else have you been working on? We talked a shitload about Genesis and about the evolution of some of the things that you've worked on. What's the current focus that you have? Anything?
Well, right now it's just comparing clones. I got my AVS in.
AVS is pretty awesome, right?
Yeah, not with the original firmware this thing came with. I don't know why this came with firmware 1.0 when I got it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I took an audio sample on it. It was so bad that I had to immediately flash the firmware 1.2 on it.
So when I received it, when I first got it to review, it came with 1.0, but the different firmware was already out. And Brian had said, "Hey, by the way, just make sure to use it." So I don't. Yeah, the fact that you got it with the very first firmware is strange.
Yeah, and this is from the second batch too. With the
oh wow, really?
Yeah. One thing I will say, and I did have a look inside the USB port, is actually, I think it's part through-hole, part surface mount. It's not that surface-mounted one that could easily rip off the board.
So that was the updated design. Now,
yeah,
did you use the beta firmware that has the FBX color profile in there?
I think there's a finalized 1.2 now.
Yeah, that's the one you should use, because
that's the one I have on this, and I do have the unsaturated version 6 selected.
Good, yeah, it's the best
although
choice.
For whenever I do software emulation, or even on my NES RGB, I use the NTSC Direct palette.
Oh, yeah?
Because I try to match it to what the XRGB Mini gets out of the NES's composite out.
Right, out of your version 9 motherboard.
Yeah, that's my reference. Although I do actually have... I will mention one thing. I'm currently actually working on a... Let me get them out here. They're in my shelf. I have the Classic Edition systems that I'm currently working on a huge comparison video. I got them both here, NES and Super NES.
Oh, cool.
And I'm trying to gather major hardware revisions of each system. Clones, software emulation, even a Retron 5. And the idea is to just make this big comparison where I just play a certain segment of each of the 30 and 21 games on each system and just go through, starting with the original consoles, fully unmodified. Then I move on to the Classic Editions, Nintendo's previous efforts with the Virtual Console. Then I move to hardware clones, of which there are actually quite a number of different types for NES and Super NES.
And some are really terrible.
Oh my god. Yeah, I'm sure you remember this.
Oh yeah, I still have mine.
Yeah, this is among one of the worst clones I've ever tested.
Yeah, I mean, when I interviewed Chris, he was very, very open and honest about it being an entry-level toy for people that, just
Yeah,
want to play a couple of cards.
it's strange that it's strange though because this actually doesn't feel like a cheap clone to me. It actually feels
No, the
pretty
plastic
sturdy.
itself, that's a real mold. So
Yeah,
that's
this is
really good
actually
quality plastic.
it really is. It's very thick, and at least on mine, the solder work is not that bad on it.
But the thing with that, where I could absolutely speak for experience, is if they know that they're going to sell 100,000, because that's about the tolerance of those where you have to get a new tool. It's actually cheaper overall to spend 50 grand, maybe even a little more, depending on what like those the curve in the end and like the vents, like that stuff actually adds a lot of cost. But it might actually be cheaper to spend 50, 60, 70 grand on those, because then each piece costs about $1. So overall, you have 150 grand to sell 100,000. That means you just add $1.50 to each cost for a really nice plastic, and it's cheaper than other methods. So that actually does make sense to me.
I actually do have a question for you regarding the Retron HD. Does yours stutter?
What do you mean by stutter?
Because on my TV over HDMI, it seems like it's skipping frames depending on what's on screen.
That's a good question. The TV that I used to do the most testing is an absolute piece of garbage. It was perfect to fit in my office. It's compatible with every resolution, so I just use it just to do some testing.
I do have to actually mention a compatibility note, and I do actually have a comparison going with this thing right now, but this samples audio 32 kilohertz over HDMI, and I noticed that this TV behind me doesn't even take it.
Yeah, that's an issue with a lot of mods like this, like the GC Video HDMI mod. Some TVs actually aren't compatible with the audio out of that, but not many. So I'm wondering where it is.
In this case, it's actually a sample rate that the TV doesn't support, because my Sharp LCD that's not on screen here, that one takes the audio fine. But what I noticed too is that at least with the Elgato Gain Capture HD60, if I pass this through first and then take the HDMI out to this TV, I get sound.
Interesting. Huh.
It's almost, to me, it seems like it's probably resampling to 48 kilohertz. That's what I would assume, or maybe even 44.1. But regardless, I have to have the Gain Capture HD60 actually alter the audio feed first.
Weird. Yeah, I mean, stuff like that to me, there's absolutely a place in the market for it. It's not me, and it's definitely not you, but there is a place in the market for toys like that. So, it's just not quality, but you also don't pay quality prices. It's pretty damn
if
cheap.
You will allow me actually to mention that I'm trying to actually get some clone designs out myself, and I did post a teaser video on my channel. I'm going to announce it here that I am actually trying to prototype a couple of different clone designs.
For which systems?
For now, just NES, but I'm going to move to Genesis later. Actually, if you'll excuse me for a little moment, this is actually kind of falling apart right now because I would just quickly wired it up as a test. This is... I'm not sure I'm actually going to mass produce this, except maybe as a portable, but I have here this 3 PCB mess of wires, which you could probably recognize the slot. I don't know if you'll recognize... I actually have to... Over here, this is actually a QFP NOAC on it.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, a fairly old chip that I had actually found in a clone at a flea market. And it seemed to actually be not that bad, at least for an entry-level clone. It does work with Castlevania 3, and it does work with Rad Racer 2.
Oh, okay.
Which, those are the two big problem games that I have. Especially because what I see most clones do is they omit, and this was actually mentioned in last week's podcast, I think Voltar was actually the one who mentioned it, that the CHR not A13 address line is missing on a lot of clones. And that's really the big issue with Castlevania 3, but what also affects Rad Racer 2 is an input known as CIRAM not chip enable, or not CE for short, which that actually controls the PPU's internal RAM. Rad Racer 2 actually permanently disables this because it has its own RAM in the cartridge.
You know, that's one of the things about those old cartridge games that we definitely don't get nowadays, is if the hardware of the console wouldn't do what it needed, just added the chip right on the PCB of the cart.
Yeah, not anymore. You get things like the PlayStation 4 Pro and Xbox One X. If you need more hardware, you just go out and get something with more powerful hardware inside.
Yeah.
Not exactly that practical, especially for someone like me who likes to collect hardware, especially really quirky things. And even sometimes, back to what I was saying with the NES Classic Edition and Super NES Classic Edition comparisons, there are some systems that I'm using as stand-ins because of how scarce they are. And this is specifically the revised versions of the top-loader NES, the J10 variant board revision of the RF top-loader NES, and the NESN CPU AV01, which is the composite model that the only documentation I've ever seen on it is a set of pictures and a video on YouTube.
Really? Nothing else?
That's it. But from what I can tell, just by observing the circuitry, at least the NESN CPU AV01 is pretty much a carbon copy of the AV Famicom, except for an extra transistor circuit on the audio out. But it's the exact same circuit. And personally, I think that transistor circuit shouldn't even be there. Because at least with the disk system, if you try to do a gain fix on the AV Famicom, because that internal lamp is just crap, it just screws up expansion audio balance like hell, you get very bad distortion, at least of the disk system.
Huh. Interesting.
That was one thing I noticed. Every time I would mod an AV Famicom to fix up the audio circuit, I just get distorted garbage from a disk system.
Huh.
But I went so far as to, this is going to seem like a really dumb mod, but I did this on purpose because I really don't have any other option. Just looks like your basic AV Famicom. I actually stuffed an RF box on it. This is my stand-in for the J10 revision top-loader NES, the one that's supposed to correct the vertical lines problem.
Jeez, that's awesome.
Yeah, it's actually, what I found was that the audio circuit is the same as on just a basic NESN CPU 01 top loader, which is 160 ohm pull down resistors and then 200 and 100 ohm resistors mixing the audio together. Capacitor, series capacitor, 1 microfarad, 220 PF to ground, and a 39 microhenry inductor into the RF box. So replicated that there. But then I found that the video circuit was actually the same base as the AV Famicom, but the resistor layout is not the same. And what I discovered by messing around with this was that the arrangement was, because on an AV Famicom is typically a 300 ohm pull-up resistor at the emitter of the 2SA937 transistor, followed by a capacitor, an inductor, and a 110 ohm resistor out to the AV connector. On this, from what I found, was that it's set up like the old Famicom in that it's a 300 ohm series resistor out the transistor, and at that junction, it splits off into a 110 ohm pull-up resistor, and that inductor that I don't exactly know the exact value is straight to the RF box with a 330 PF capacitor to ground. And it does give a much better result. No vertical lines, and the colors actually look better too.
So I'm assuming that you're going to take all of this knowledge that you've been picking up and put it in your clone machine when it's ready.
Well, I would actually prefer to get something with HDMI.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but one thing that I was tossing around was possibly integrate, because it's still possible to make discrete clone designs. Because I did find a fairly good clone CPU, although it does have a bit of a quirk in that the clock divider is higher than what's in a 2A03. So I have to use two separate clocks for the PPU and CPU. And what I was considering was to possibly integrate an NES RGB directly on the board and have possibly I'm not sure if maybe integrating an OSSC or something else so that it has both analog and digital outs.
Interesting.
That was just an idea I was tossing around. But I'm also thinking I don't have enough knowledge of FPGAs yet.
Right.
But I would actually go...
That's a whole other world to dig into.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just trying it out myself, I had issues just trying to define a bidirectional bus. Because you could define a pin as being bidirectional, but then to actually have it internally split off as in-out, the actual control signals, I don't actually really know how to work that yet.
So do you know about how far away are you from a prototype that you could show off? Is it months, years?
Well, that board I showed you is a working prototype, although I do have to fix my wires.
Okay,
and
so
I
we're probably
do have
months out from
footage.
something that you could send out for review, I guess, then.
Yeah, I do have capture footage, actually, on my channel of the discrete clone design was actually prototyped in a top-loader NES with a socketed CPU and PPU. But the idea is to then possibly integrate more of that, at least into a CPLD, so that the discrete logic doesn't take up as much board space, and
Gotcha.
integrate level shifters if I end up with a 3.3 volt version, because I've actually got some absolutely horrific sites when it comes to using 3.3 volt devices in 5 volt electronics. Well, we know about the
yes,
cartridges.
It's almost like somebody should write an article about that and then get flamed by random people on the internet who don't understand.
Yeah. And I'll tell you
Poor
one
Renee.
clone that's actually really made me rage, and it's the Super Retro Trio. This is specifically version 2 of the system. What the hell did RetroRGB do with this thing? Because they actually had
I've never even used one. When I see those things, I usually just turn around and walk away.
You really shouldn't, because there are some that are actually genuinely not that bad. I mean, version 1 of this is actually really good.
Oh, wow, really?
Except for one issue, and that's the RAM on the Super NES slot. Because these use 3.3 volt RAM, the entire system's 5 volts, and the RAM is overvolted.
Wow.
We're literally talking 5 volts VCC going to the chip. And 5 volt I/O.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you look at the data sheets, you will see that the absolute maximum rating doesn't even reach 5 volts, it's 4.6. And even then, you should never have your design run the chips at that voltage.
No. Heat tolerances, there's so many variants to it. You really should plan on running your design at 75%, because there's just so many other factors involved that that affect this and would really severely shorten the life of or actually damage some of these things.
Yeah, and I mean, if I ever end up making a Super NES clone, there's only one clone chipset I've ever seen. Although it did get shrunk down over time. I think the first time I saw this shrunken design was in 2011 with a FC Twin that I don't exactly remember what was the revision. Well, actually, I don't actually know which one it is, because I've seen 5 different internals on the FC Twin. The first revision actually had a really shit NOAC. There's actually a carryover from the FC Game Console version 1, which is the typical type that has reverse duty cycles.
Oh.
And that's how you get the weird audio like what you experience with the Retron HD. Because what ends up happening in that is that 2 of the bits that select the duty cycles are reversed, and you end up with I think it's 25 and 50% that are reversed. And so what you get is, if you have a sound that's made for 25%, you get 50% and vice versa.
Wow, that seems like a pretty big mistake.
Yeah, and that originated from a UMC manufactured 2A03 clone.
Jeez.
Which, to this day in 2017, is still a huge issue. And every time I say something about those things, I always end up bashing them for it, because there is absolutely no excuse to use a chipset like that when you have better designs that have already been in clones since 2007, when the FC Twin was revised to version 2.
Yeah, that stuff disappoints me. So
If it disappoints you, it actually makes me rage.
I will make sure to leave a link to your YouTube channel that shows the examples of this stuff. And it's really exciting that somebody's trying to approach clones from a little bit different perspective. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what the stuff that you come up with for these.
Yeah, because clones are actually good alternatives as long as you go with the right system for your needs, because there are some people who are more tolerant of inaccuracies. And for those, I mean, some of the HDMI clones could actually be okay, except maybe for EverDrive compatibility, which I still have not figured out what the deal is with that.
Yeah.
But It's so strange because it's just the latest reverse duty cycle NOACs with HDMI outs that do that, because the 8-bit HD, the first revision, works with the EverDrive NATE, but the later version 2, and also everything else that came after that, the Retron HD, and also Retrobit's RAS Plus, don't work with that. And I still have to actually get that in for testing.
Huh. So I don't mean to put you on the spot like this or anything, but with the new revision of the website coming out, would you be willing, whenever you had free time, to dump your info on what's a good clone, what's a bad clone, and maybe just, whatever's the most time efficient for you? Just because I certainly don't want to take up hours of your time. But
hey, well, as long as I'm not doing any university work or modding, repairing, prototyping designs, I mean, I'm up for it. As long as it doesn't impede on what's more important for me.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the whole point of the new site, is just, a thing where whenever people have time, if you have info, post it there. And, I'm not saying don't go to other forums, but if you have a great forum conversation about something, don't let it get lost. Stick it on this, link back to...
because... You really should archive that thing, because sometimes you'll end up with good information that gets lost. Like, I had stumbled upon one of your older videos that showed Mega Man 9 and 10 on the Wii that you could force to 480p, and the link was dead.
Yeah. Yep. And I didn't save it, so...
Oh, that sucks.
Yeah, so all that information I want to save...
That would actually be really good to run at 240p, though.
Yeah,
especially
there's issues in why that couldn't happen, but I think with some clever hacking, you'd be able to get those WADs running at 240p.
Yeah, you'd probably have to tweak the game code a little more than probably just setting a flag. Which is that really what ended up happening with sending it to 480p?
I think it. I can't really remember. It was so long ago, and I've done so much stuff between then, but. Yeah, that's, regardless of whatever happens at the Indiegogo, the site's going to be released. It might be released blank at that point, but it's going to be finished, and it's going to be open to the public forever for free. So I hope so much of this info isn't lost, because people put so much time into this stuff, and just try to find... somebody's revelation about a board revision buried in a thread somewhere. Forget it. You'll spend more time doing that than you would trying to figure it out yourself. So,
yeah, even just to try to get information on some obscure Genesis clone chipsets is freaking difficult, and I always end up with Russian forums, especially because it seems like those things are really common over there. And what I'd like to actually do is... there is a interesting clone chip of the Genesis that integrates the 68000, the Z80, bus arbiter I/O controller, and even a YM3438 that I personally plan on shutting off, and put a YM2612 in its place, that I could then connect an RGB VDP clone to, and get a design out like that I could then have analog video and even HDMI if I could get a good ADC on that.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. So, geez, I gotta have you back on a different time to talk about your clone stuff. This is awesome. I mean, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do all this. This was, I think people are really gonna appreciate and enjoy the info that you shared, and we have to do this again between now and never. I mean, this was
it's always a pleasure to share knowledge, because for me, I get more satisfaction out of helping others learn than actually teaching myself.
Yeah, me too. Obviously, with the website, I mean, I wouldn't waste my time on it if I didn't. And it's just, I've started to really realize how much the followers of this channel really appreciate the more technical end of stuff. So while I do love all of the interviews I do, I always, almost always, there was that one, but I almost always have a great time. But my heart is always buried deep in the technical stuff. So things like this, I just turn into a wide-eyed kid again when we start digging into some of the real, more technical ends of things. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Anytime.
I'm going to have a link to your YouTube channel down below. Where's are you on social media or anything? Do you want me to put a link to Twitter or any of that stuff?
All I have is Twitter. I don't want anything to do with Facebook personally.
Yeah, I don't either. So, all right. Yeah. Well, the links will be down below. I will definitely be talking to you again about this stuff, and I'll see everybody next time.
See ya.